Darcy is, without a doubt, a hypocrite. Revisiting Pride and Prejudice with a critical eye reveals that his character is far more flawed than his romantic redemption arc might suggest. While his insulting proposal to Elizabeth Bennet is often cited as evidence of his arrogance, his hypocrisy runs much deeper. Darcy's disdain for the Bennet family's impropriety is glaring, but what makes it particularly galling is his failure to recognize the flaws within his own circle. He judges the Bennets harshly for their lack of refinement, yet he seems blind to the similar, or even worse, behavior exhibited by his own family, friends, and even himself. The only real difference between Darcy and the Bennets is wealth and social standing, which he uses as a shield to excuse the very behaviors he condemns in others. Take, for example, his infamous first proposal to Elizabeth. Darcy openly criticizes the behavior of her younger sisters, her mother, and even her father. While it's true that Mrs. Bennet's lack of manners and her failure to properly guide her younger daughters is a legitimate flaw, Darcy's condemnation reeks of hypocrisy. His own sister, Georgiana, who was raised with every advantage, governesses, masters, and a thorough education in propriety, still managed to behave scandalously. She entered into a secret relationship with Wickham and nearly eloped with him, an act that could have ruined her reputation and brought shame to the Darcy family. Yet, Darcy excuses Georgiana's actions, framing her as a victim of Wickham's manipulation rather than acknowledging her own poor judgment. This double standard is striking. Darcy holds the Bennet sisters to an impossibly high standard while giving his sister a pass for behavior that is, by his own definition, improper and unacceptable. His inability to see this contradiction reveals a stunning lack of self-awareness. Darcy's hypocrisy extends beyond his sister to his own family. At Rosings Park, we meet Lady Catherine de Bourgh, Darcy's aunt, whose behavior is as ridiculous and obnoxious as Mr. Collins's. Lady Catherine is pompous, condescending, and utterly lacking in self-awareness. She makes absurd pronouncements, such as claiming that she and her daughter would have been proficient in many skills if only they had learned them, a statement that begs the question, why didn't they? Unlike Elizabeth, Lady Catherine had the wealth and resources to pursue any education she desired, yet she chose not to. Her behavior as a hostess is equally appalling. She is rude, pushy, and dismissive of her guests. Yet Darcy not only tolerates her behavior but seems to accept it as normal. Why? Because her title and wealth grant her a free pass in his eyes. This is yet another example of Darcy's hypocrisy. He condemns the Bennets for their lack of propriety but turns a blind eye to the same flaws in his own family. Darcy's double standards are not limited to his relatives. Consider his friend Caroline Bingley, whose behavior is far from exemplary. Caroline is mean-spirited, petty, and spiteful, particularly toward Elizabeth and her family. During Jane's illness at Netherfield Park, Caroline's thinly veiled insults and condescending remarks are anything but proper. Yet Darcy never calls her out on this behavior. In his world, it seems, laughing too loudly or being outspoken in public is a grave offense, but acting superior and disdainful is perfectly acceptable, as long as you're wealthy. Darcy finds the Bennets improper, but he has no issue with Caroline's behavior, even allowing her to associate with his beloved sister Georgiana. This inconsistency is baffling. If Darcy truly abhorred disguise of every sort, as he once claimed, why did he not condemn Caroline's thinly veiled mockery of Elizabeth and her family? Either he was willfully ignorant of her behavior, or he simply didn't care, both of which unders his hypocrisy. And then there's Darcy himself. Before Elizabeth humbles him, he is insufferably obnoxious. Despite his training as a gentleman, he publicly insults Elizabeth's appearance at the Meryton Assembly, loudly enough for her and others to overhear. Even by modern standards, this is appalling behavior. A true gentleman would have found a more tactful way to decline dancing, but Darcy's arrogance and disdain for those he considers beneath him override any sense of decorum. His interference in Jane and Charles Bingley's relationship is another example of his high-handedness. Darcy convinces Bingley that Jane's feelings are not genuine, effectively sabotaging their romance. While he later claims this was done out of concern for his friend, it's hard to ignore the classist undertones of his actions. Darcy believes the Bennets are beneath Bingley, and he uses his influence to enforce this belief, all while ignoring the emotional toll it takes on both Jane and Bingley. This meddling is not only hypocritical but also deeply selfish, as it prioritizes Darcy's own prejudices over the happiness of others. In the end, Darcy's journey towards self-awareness and redemption is a central theme of Pride and Prejudice, but it's important to acknowledge just how far he had to come. His initial behavior is a masterclass in hypocrisy, as he judges others for flaws he himself possesses. Whether it's his family's impropriety, his friends' bad behavior, or his own arrogance, Darcy consistently holds others to a higher standard than he holds himself. It's only through Elizabeth's rejection and her pointed criticisms that he begins to recognize his own failings and works to become a better person. This transformation is what makes Darcy a compelling character, but it doesn't erase the fact that, at his core, he was once a hypocritical prat who needed a serious reality check. If Elizabeth had accepted Darcy's first proposal, the fallout would have been nothing short of spectacularly awkward, not just for Darcy but for everyone involved. Let's unpack the layers of hypocrisy and social tension that would have unfolded, particularly in his relationship with Bingley. Darcy's interference in Jane and Bingley's courtship was rooted in his belief that the Bennet family was beneath them socially, yet his own proposal to Elizabeth would have exposed the glaring contradictions in his actions and beliefs. What on earth would he have said to Bingley to justify his sudden about-face? The mental gymnastics required would have been Olympic level. First, consider Darcy's initial reasoning for discouraging Bingley from pursuing Jane. He claimed that Jane's feelings were not genuine and that her family's lack of propriety made her an unsuitable match. He even went so far as to imply that Mrs. Bennet's vulgarity and the younger sister's wild behavior were enough to taint Jane's reputation by association. Yet, if Elizabeth had accepted his proposal, Darcy would have had to explain why it was acceptable for him to marry into the very same family he had deemed unworthy for his friend. Can you imagine the conversation? "Bingley, old chap, I know I told you that the Bennets were beneath us and that Jane's affections were questionable, but, it turns out I've fallen in love with Elizabeth." "Yes, the very same family." No, it's different when it's me. You see, I'm me. And Elizabeth is exceptional." "Yes, that's it. Exceptional. So, while Jane was clearly not good enough for you, Elizabeth is perfectly suitable for me. Do try to understand." The sheer audacity of such a conversation would have been breathtaking. Darcy would have had to reconcile his previous disdain for the Bennets with his newfound admiration for Elizabeth, all while trying to maintain his moral high ground. It's hard to imagine Bingley not calling him out on his hypocrisy. After all, if the Bennets were so improper, how could Darcy justify marrying into the family? And if Elizabeth was so exceptional, why hadn't he recognized her worth earlier, instead of insulting her at the Meryton Assembly and later during his proposal? Cognitive dissonance would have been palpable. Moreover, Darcy's interference in Jane and Bingley's relationship would have made his own courtship of Elizabeth even more awkward. Imagine the tension at family gatherings or social events. Bingley, who had been persuaded to give up Jane based on Darcy's advice, would now have to watch Darcy marry into the same family he had deemed unsuitable. The irony would not have been lost on anyone, least of all Bingley. Would Darcy have tried to backtrack on his earlier criticisms of the Bennets? Would he have suddenly found virtues in Mrs. Bennet's exuberance or Lydia's liveliness? It's hard to imagine him doing so without looking like a complete hypocrite. And then there's the matter of Caroline Bingley. Darcy's proposal to Elizabeth would have been a direct slap in the face to Caroline, who had spent months trying to win his favor. Caroline's disdain for Elizabeth and her family was no secret, and her shock at Darcy's choice would have been matched only by her outrage. She would have been quick to point out the hypocrisy of Darcy's actions, likely with biting sarcasm and thinly veiled insults. "How fascinating, Mr. Darcy, that you once found the Bennets so beneath us, yet now you've chosen to align yourself with them. I suppose love truly does blind one to certain deficiencies." The awkwardness would have extended to the Bennet family as well. Mrs. Bennet, who had already been slighted by Darcy's interference with Bingley and Jane, would have been torn between triumph at securing such a wealthy suitor for Elizabeth and lingering resentment over his previous actions. Mr. Bennet, with his sharp wit, would have undoubtedly made a few pointed remarks about Darcy's change of heart. And Elizabeth herself, had she accepted Darcy's first proposal, would have had to navigate the tension between her new fiancé and her family, particularly Jane, who had been hurt by Darcy's meddling. In short, Darcy's proposal to Elizabeth, had it been accepted, would have exposed the full extent of his hypocrisy and created a web of social awkwardness that even Jane Austen might have struggled to untangle. It's a testament to Darcy's growth as a character that he eventually recognizes his flaws and works to make amends, but the sheer absurdity of his initial position cannot be ignored. The man who once looked down on the Bennets with such disdain would have had to eat a heaping serving of humble pie, and it would have been a deeply uncomfortable meal. So that's all my thoughts on Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. But I'd like to know what you think. Am I being too harsh on this guy, or am I actually making some sense? And oh, if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel for more content like this.